Well, if you're a little nervous that we're going to dig deep into the Mets and why they're losing games and why they're not a playoff team, don't worry, because there's a lot more big picture stuff that you can talk about with a national baseball writer, which is our special guest on this episode. Hannah Kaiser of Yahoo Sports joins us. It starts right now. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's Doug Williams and Hannah Kaiser with you on this episode of the Shea Anything podcast. And a reminder to subscribe, rate, and review Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening. We appreciate it. And Shea Anything is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. And once again, Baseball Night in New York, weeknights at 6 o'clock, the show that I host. And Hannah joins us, I don't know, maybe once a week. We don't really have a regular schedule, but Hannah's been a great addition to the show. And we've added a couple national writers, which has been really fun because the Mets season hasn't gone great. So it's been nice to be able to talk to people who basically are studying all the teams equally. And the other thing about Hannah is that she lives in Brooklyn and her apartment gives you the most like stereotypical New York City, like natural sounds. So we've already gotten a couple car horns in, Hannah. It's early, but maybe we'll get some yelling. I'm just curious to hear.
Almost certainly you'll get a fire truck. I live close to a fire station, firehouse. I live at what I believe is the worst intersection in the world. Like whoever designed these traffic patterns did not stick around to see the havoc that they wrought. I constantly want to go out there and tell people, I have lived here for years and you are not the first person to be frustrated. You really don't need to honk. I promise it's always like this.
It's funny, like after living in New York City as long as I have, there are a bunch of things. I hope I never have to move into a new apartment because it's such a pain and we love our current place. But I have a list of things that now I'm going to look at if I do move, which is maybe instead of looking at like the appliances or the ceilings or whatever, just stop and wait for silence and see if there's a noise problem or, maybe test the water pressure. Like these are the things that really affect your quality of life. Is there construction around you? Those are the things that matter.
I live in what I believe, at least I've been saying this for a couple of years because I think someone told me it once, the oldest continuously operated residential building in Brooklyn. So it's beautiful. You guys can't see it, but you can, because sometimes on view, I have really a ridiculously beautiful sort of like crown molding everywhere, great wood floors. I have outdoor space, have high ceilings. I have a very strange chandelier that I'm looking at. And so when my husband and I saw this place, we thought, this is amazing. And it is the loudest place on the planet.
Unfortunately, like I know we're doing this via Zoom and some of our podcasts will be clipped off, but I don't think Jeff is going to clip off just you talking about your apartment.
All right. Well, you'll have to trust me. You'll have to trust me. There's some beautiful windows.
You have a very cool wooden door behind you or whatever that is. It's nice. It's nice.
Windows. Look at that. That's beautiful.
So that is beautiful. So the way that Jeff started our rundown is welcome to a very sad episode of Shea Anything, which in reality is what it is. It's, the Mets are officially eliminated. They got swept by the Brewers. Just, it feels like they were pushing towards a playoff spot, never really got there. And now it's just become a little bit even worse than it was. And I feel like, Hannah, we've had you on the show since the beginning of the season and there were high expectations. What do you think about the fact that we're here and that, things definitely not go according to plan?
So this is going to sound exculpatory, and it's not. So this is going to sound good for the Mets, but I promise it's its own set of problems. I think when the Mets were maybe not playing well, but when they were in first, because it's an easy division or a unexpectedly easy division, I think we all sort of forgot that heading into this season, the offseason was a mess and that it's really tough to go from, total power vacuum, everything at the top is changing, to being on a level playing field with teams. I mean, one of the things that's really hard to keep in mind when you are sort of only following one team and you see their expectations and you see the players that they're signing is that like there are 29 other teams that are also trying to make the best possible decisions. And for the Mets, I really do think that they were even before we got into some of the messier stuff this season, handicapped by their offseason. That, you can't make decisions until you have the people in place who are supposed to make those decisions. And they spent a lot of the offseason making the decision to find those people, and in some cases failing to find those people in the case of a president of baseball operations. And so they have great players. I mean, I think they truly have great players, and a big problem with this season has been a lot of those players underperforming. But I also just think a big problem with this season is that they never had a coherent plan or cohesive plan. And they never, I'm sure we'll talk about more of this as we get into the details with what they'll do this upcoming offseason and the top of the front office. But Zach Scott, who is no longer the acting interim GM, but who was for a little bit, his job was supposed to be to sort of build out this infrastructure, make it a more modern front office under Jared Porter, who then we don't have Jared Porter. We don't have a president of baseball operations. Zach Scott had gotten to do a little bit of work. It's like, even if everything had gone really well, you're still talking about a team that's trying to pivot the way they operate in their front office while also playing out a baseball season. I mean, in the ideal circumstances, you're still talking about a team that changed its owner, changed its president of baseball operations, changed its GM, and tried to implement sort of a new, whatever it was that they wanted Zach Scott to build out on the operations analytics side. All of that would have been brand new, even if everything had gone according to plan. And then none of that went according to plans.
I think it's a great point. I think even myself, not to speak for fans or people listening, but when you watch the games, you're not thinking about that stuff. Like, you're not thinking about front office turmoil or the turnover. You're thinking about, why is Lindor underperforming? Michael Conforto isn't a contract here. I thought, coming off of 2020, it would be the best we've ever seen him. Even though that stuff matters so much, I think you get lost in the moment when you're watching a game, wondering why so-and-so striking out in a big spot. Why is Edwin Diaz not a reliable closer? But you're right. Those things permeate, they matter. And by the way, even which may have been a result of all of this, Chili Davis bringing in Hugh Quattlebaum. And like, that's an example of, clearly, you had Porter, you had Scott, you have Alderson over everything, trying to hire a bigger name than basically both of those guys were. And Sandy Alderson never believed in the philosophy, clearly, of Chili Davis. The players did. They bought in. And then you fire him and you put in a more analytical guy in Quattlebaum, who, I said this last week, other than giving me my hotel alias for the rest of my life, Mr. Quattlebaum, what can we get for room service, please? I don't really know how that improved anything. I mean, it didn't, clearly. But so you're right, that those problems kind of permeate, and the turnover is so important to analyze. And I want to ask you about Steve Cohen, because you mentioned them not being able to find the president of baseball operations. Sandy Alderson was supposed to be, like, Andy has made this point in the podcast, he was supposed to be the one in charge of, like, if they needed a new chef on the road, like, that's under Sandy. Everything. It's not baseball, it's business ops, it's everything. He ended up being the GM twice because of Porter and Scott, and not just the president of baseball ops, but so his role changed completely. What do you think about Steve Cohen and his ability to now look at the biggest names that might be available for him for that job? Do you think that he has an advantage because he is who he is, or is he at a disadvantage because he's so public with his opinions, et cetera?
Well, I think he's at an advantage because of who he is, because of his money. I think I hope that Steve Cohen has taken this past year to learn what he didn't know about the business of baseball, because it's not just another business. I mean, no business is just another business. I don't know Steve Cohen. I've never talked to him. I'm going to take a shot at him anyway right now, which is that he seems like someone who, a lot of billionaires have this. They think that their money is a reflection of their value as a human being, and they must just be better than everyone else at everything. And that's why they're so rich. It's just sort of, it's a one metric world, and I think he got a little bit, am I allowed to curse, his ass handed to him this year, in terms of realizing that just because you've been successful doesn't mean you are ready to navigate what is a very insular world and has its own customs and that sort of thing. And I think I like a eccentric owner. I think all owners should have to have Twitter. That sounds like total fun for me. All owners, all GMs, I want you guys to be out there. I want you to be accountable. I appreciate that. I actually think that there's a world in which Steve Cohen's willingness to interact with the fans and his accessibility in that way that's part of the sort of what makes the Mets unique. It feels like the Mets have always had a particular relationship with their ownership. We'll put it that way, that the fans, they feel passionately about the franchise as a whole. And I like that for the team. And I like that for the fan base. I think that whether or not that is what a Theo Epstein or a David Stearns wants to walk into from a business perspective is a different matter. But, if Steve Cohen is as smart as he thinks he is, he will figure out how he needs to behave to operate in what is its own little world, which is the business of baseball.
Yeah, I think what Mets fans loved about the Cohen ownership bid, even before he got the team, was a combination of his money, but also the fact that he was a genuine fan, because that's the most ideal scenario. Mm-hmm. Is you get a really, really rich fan who just wants to do this, not just as a hobby, but more than that. And I think Mets fans are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt 10 times over because of that they see him as one of them, that occasionally, yes, he'll be irrational. And occasionally, yes, he'll tweet out at the haters, even though he should be way far beyond like needing to stoop that low on Twitter to be like, where are the haters now? I think they see a little bit of an aspirational side where they're like, that is so cool that he doesn't have to really care. Like, to be so rich that who cares? I'll do what I need to do to get this team in a winning state of mind, because it doesn't matter what I do or what I say. I'm going to make grammatical errors on Twitter, and it doesn't matter who's going to call me out.
Well, I think that's what we're seeing is he needs to learn what does matter. Sort of, you're not so rich that you can do anything you want if the best baseball operations people don't want to work for you. That's sort of that's the push and pull that
right.
If he wants to operate like someone who can do whatever he wants because his money will buy him out of that situation, then why didn't we have a baseball operation? The president of baseball operations heading into this season. It's clear that he's operating that way, and that's fun and that's great, and the fans love it. And I hope for our content's sake that he is able to continue that going forward, but also build a successful team. But I'm not sure that he will. I think that at some point, I think a lot of the I'm going to transition us into what I assume we'll talk about, which is I think a lot of the biggest fish, the biggest names, the people who are bigger than the Jared Porters and the Zach Scotts out there, that they want an owner who's not going to meddle. In fact, what they want is an ownership stake. Your Billy Beans, your Theo Epsteins, they want an ownership stake. But in lieu of that, or in the absence of that, they definitely want to feel like they're in control. I think, I don't know. A lot of people who cover the team more intimately than I have floated names like Theo and names like Billy Bean. But to me, this is like totally my opinion. Just what I would be not surprised if they are hired, but I would want to know what it is that Steve Cohen said to them to convince them that he's not going to meddle. Because if you're looking at it from the outside, you're thinking that's an owner who's going to meddle, and
right.
that's the fan in him. But if what you want as a person who runs a baseball operations department is an owner who's not going to meddle, I'm not sure the Mets are for you.
Well, then I hope you can get the assignment of being on that Zoom if they do hire one of those people, because I know you'll ask that question. And I did want to ask you, because I honestly, it stopped me in my tracks. The Zoom after the Jared Porter firing, you were talking to Sandy Alderson. You asked him a question because he was talking about that they did what they thought was all the research necessary on his background. And, it seemed like such a surprise that this could have happened. It was the Porter thing, right? Not a Callaway.
Yes.
I'm sorry for mixing it up, but
that was
that's
a
just
Porter
been,
one.
this has been the year in Mets land. So you asked him, were any of the people that you talked to about Porter's background women? And Sandy Alderson just said no. And, eventually he got into a little bit more of the depth of that answer, but I thought it was a great question. I thought it was an honest answer by Sandy. And I think he's been, for the most part, accountable. And I want to know if you agree or disagree with that about his hirings and his misfires here. But I think, I guess I just want to ask you a very broad question. How can the Mets avoid getting this wrong again?
It's tough. I was thinking about that. I was thinking heading into this that presumably it's on their radar now, and they must be asking themselves the same question. How do we avoid making this same mistake? Because it's not all their fault. A lot of it is the industry, because these things don't always get reported in a way that you could dig up just from looking at someone's permanent record or speaking to their higher ups or checking their performance reviews. But that is, of course, the problem with the industry, is that so to back up, yes, I thought Sandy was actually, I appreciated his honesty in that moment, both in saying no, that they had not spoken to any women, but I also found his elaboration to be very illuminating, maybe more illuminating even than he intended it. He said, well, Jared Porter's never had a female boss, which, to be fair, I think is not entirely true. There is an assistant GM who's a woman at the Red Sox, but also that is its own answer. He said, Jared Porter's never had a woman who was a boss who we could have spoken to, which may sound incredibly obvious, but there's no reason for that to be the case in an entire industry. It's not like there are no women who are qualified to be bosses of men who work in baseball. That hierarchy is not innate. But beyond that, that dichotomy in the industry, this idea where so often the bosses are men, and if there are women, they are more entry level. And even if the numbers make it seem like there are a lot of women, they are all at that sort of lower level. And that if we want to figure out sort of what's wrong with both that layout and why they're not moving up, I think we should be talking to people who have worked for somebody. I don't know why we would expect someone who is someone's boss to have intimate knowledge of the way, particularly if you're hiring for a management role. If you're hiring this, this doesn't even have to sort of be an issue of sexual harassment or that genre of inappropriate behavior. I would hope that if Sandy thought it was a good question, which I did too, that if he thought anything about sort of how he ended up in that place, sitting in his kitchen on that Zoom answering that question, that it's not just sort of, well, how do we hire someone who's never sexually harassed anybody? I hope he thinks more holistically around what does it mean to hire someone to be in a position of power, and what kinds of information would you want in making those decisions. And think across the board, whether it's baseball or not baseball, particularly since so many of these male-dominated industries are male-dominated in the sense that the men are at the top. I hope we want to hear what those people are like as bosses. I hope we want to hear from the people who have been managed by them and not just the people who manage them.
I think, to your point, and I without knowing, I feel like I know that Sandy knew that was a good question, because he's a smart man. And I feel like he probably did some introspective thinking about how he got there. And I do think it's interesting, Hannah, that we're talking about Theo Epstein as a potential name that is being floated. And Porter and Jeff has made this point, by the way. He deserves the credit because he's been talking about this for a while now. We've been talking about Porter and Zach Scott, who made a mistake of an entirely different nature. Yes, Theo's going to be a Hall of Fame front office guy at some point. He may end up higher up in Major League Baseball for all we know. That may be what he wants to do. But how do you start that interview if you're the Mets, given the fact that you know that it's underneath him that some of your problems that you're just now recovering from and still recovering from were kind of caused under.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think, right, that the Sandy problem of this all is that we're not holding him accountable for the hiring decisions that he's made, or at least been a part of, and he continues to get a pass. And I think you're right. I think he's a thoughtful person who's sort of trying to do right by the team. But there's no reason to bring in somebody else the hiring is the thing that has gotten the Mets into trouble. That with Porter and Zach Scott, and then you referenced Mickey Callaway, and in somewhere in there, I believe my wonderful friend Britt Giroli and Katie's Train at The Athletic reported on other Mets front office people who I think were quietly fired. That obviously there is a decision-making process that's a problem. And you're right, it seems like bringing in someone who hired a lot of those same people is just perpetuating the problem that is the hardest one to solve, which is sort of sussing these things out ahead of time, being a good read of character, whatever it is that we think the Mets have been doing wrong that's creating an endemic problem in this way. On the flip side, that's the argument against Theo. I mean, they hired Porter and Zach Scott because they liked what they had done under Theo, and they wanted them to implement a similar processes or, structure at the Mets. And they presumably started on some of that. And then whether or not Zach Scott will be allowed to continue working on that process, I'm not sure. But the Mets are in a difficult place in terms of wanting to move away from the pipeline that has created these problems, but being left with some measure of having started to build out a front office in that image. And how do you kind of bring in someone who comes from a different pipeline, or won't be saddled with so much of the same baggage, but is able to build off of a little bit what you were able to accomplish last offseason, because you can't be starting from scratch, all right, what are we going to be as a team going forward every offseason and expect to compete?
Yeah. To your first point that you made on the podcast, I mean, they need some stability. And what comes with that is not worrying about a person's reputation or how they are treating people in their workplace.
I saw a lot of stories that took the angle of sort of how do the Mets change the culture, or Steve Cohen saying things that, we won't tolerate this culture, but your culture is your people. There's not a separate thing. The Mets don't have an inherently flawed culture or whatever it is. It's the people that you hire, and that right. No one is sort of perfectly good or perfectly bad, but the culture can change as soon as you change the people. You don't need to learn, if you want to have a zero tolerance policy for these things, that's excellent, but you also want people who won't do these things, and that's sort of a more important that I trust that Steve Cohen wants to be strict on these issues and on the right side of history and all of those things. But I also hope that we keep in mind that responding correctly to gendered violence or sexual harassment, whatever it is, that those things, we often laud powerful men who respond correctly or who say the right things, but you've already lost the victim or whoever it is that, I think in the Mets situation, and this brings us back to what Sandy said about they're not talking to any women, that you don't see the women who leave the industry because of these things, or the women who don't work for the team because of these things. So the Mets can sort of try to change their culture by, coming down really hard on anyone who is guilty of such an infraction or whatever. But you're not going to have a lot of women who work in your front office if you're kind of churning through people who are guilty of these things. You got to get it right from the hiring, because that's how you build a front office where diverse perspectives want to be heard and right. Aren't just sort of sticking it out for the whatever.
And as you know, the whole conversation, I mean, better than I, is a reflection, not just I think it's easy for us to say, this is a Mets problem. The Mets have a culture problem. Right. But in reality, think about it. They've had new hires, make these mistakes, which means that they hired them from a different organization. This is not, the Mets have a hiring problem, yes, but it's a fundamental issue within the game of baseball that, yes, you can have a zero tolerance policy. Okay, that's fine. But this is going to keep happening as long as these issues are permeating through Major League Baseball and accepted within the sport. And no matter which team hires these people, probably, makes a mistake in judgment, decides that it's worth it. It means that there were problems going back to another organization. So it's not just a Mets problem. It's deeper than that, unfortunately. Hard to transition, Hannah, into baseball from there, but I do think that ahead of us is the very difficult offseason that you've been kind of mentioning, which is, look, there are some big decisions for whoever ends up getting this job. Let's start with the manager, and then we'll get to what I think is the most interesting player conversation. What do you think, first of all, of, like, Luis Rojas is not a perfect in-game manager. He is a near perfect front-facing employee of an organization. He's pretty accountable. He seems like he has good relationships with the players inside the clubhouse. Those kinds of things he seems to be good at. The in-game stuff, I'm not sure yet. What do you think about that reputation and whether it will lead to another contract for a manager in New York in 2021?
Yeah, it's hard to see him getting another contract just because of the on-field performance, even though I think you're right. I think the players do like him, and I think his relationships within the clubhouse are probably better than you think, sort of if you just watch the games. But I think that, and I also think that actually he delegates well. So a lot of the on-field failures, player to player, are sort of not necessarily his fault. But I do think we talked about the front office failures and the ways that those create instability and that. But I also think a lot of the failures have just been like literal performance failures, players underperforming what they played up to in the past, those sorts of things. And I think they already changed out Chile for Hugh Quattlebaum. There's only so much you can do to. You can't change out your whole roster, and I think you shouldn't. I think you should have some faith in these players to play up to what they've played in the past. I think a lot of that adds up to a change in the manager, even if between you and I, we think it's not Luis's fault. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I agree with you, and I think also in asking that question and listening to your answer, I realized too that I have had that thought that if, like, I'm trying to think of a stereotypical old school manager, Buck Showalter, Jim Leyland, Dusty Baker, even if any of those guys had been the Mets manager, I'm not sure the thumbs down thing happens. I'm not sure the raccoon story happens. Right. Maybe if they had a more authoritative leader in that role, who, by the way, maybe makes more money, or, maybe just has more of a foundation in the game than Luis does, which again is not his fault. But those stories might be easier to manage if you have somebody who really has fear almost within that group. And
well, think about it this way. Do you remember what Luis said about any of those things? I don't. I think that for a New York team, I tend to not feed into the to play in New York. But we shouldn't. Right. The Mets have had so many of these less serious mini dramas on field, and I can't remember Luis what he had to say about any of them. I don't think that he does a great job interfacing with the media. I think often we're left to show up the next day and accost Francisco Lindor and Javier Baez on the field and force them to apologize, or Sandy has to send out a statement. That I think actually that Rojas is missing from a lot of these narratives. We are talking about Steve Cohen's Twitter or what the players did on the field, or that I think that regardless of whether or not you can point to what Rojas did wrong, you can't really point to what he did right in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, I think he's good with, when his players are not playing well, explaining why that's happening. For the most part, he's honest about his accountability and theirs, and kind of, without throwing them under the bus, does a good job explaining why so-and-so is not in the lineup, et cetera. But I think, to your point, he has kind of been like, I didn't realize what the thumbs down thing meant. We don't stand by that at all. We love our like that's kind of the message that he puts out there, instead of like squashing it so we never hear about it. You know, that's really what his role should be. It shouldn't be anything we hear. It should be that those stories are that he has the presence within that group to end these things before they're even public. By the way, you're listening to the Shea Anything podcast. It's brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. So I thought it was interesting, and I brought it up on Baseball Night in New York with you. You, correct me if I'm wrong, wrote a column about the Baez thumbs down, booing the fans thing by talking to Mets fans outside of Citi Field. And then, of course, because it's the Mets, the next game they play, they walk it off. He loses the earring. Everybody knows the rest. And it feels like ever since that moment, Hannah, like the storylines become different because his numbers have been so good. Lindor has had a great month of September. Maybe there's a correlation there. What do you think between the reporting that you did that day to where we are now? Do you think there's actually a chance that Javier Baez is a Met long-term?
Yeah, I think there's a chance. I think that it depends on whether or not the Mets. So we talk about Javi having had a good month since then. I think a lot of that has been, it's not swinging at pitches outside the zone quite as much. He's walking more. That's great. He was already a fun, great, dynamic player. If he has sort of better plate discipline, that's great. It's interesting to think if Francisco Lindor or Javi Baez had a bad year or a bad half a season, would we have said that's just a small sample size, you shouldn't trust it? But then when they have a great month, we're like, oh my God, it's the end of the season, we should throw a bunch of money at it. So I think there's certainly a chance that they bring him back. We're going to get into the sort of Steve Cohen and how much money does he have? Because we have Robinson Cano is coming back on the books. I think that there's so many, all roads lead back to who's making these decisions.
Yeah,
for the Mets. Like, we have, they're going to have to, and then we're going to talk about the CBA and when are these decisions going to get made. And so I think from a strictly baseball perspective, I don't think you don't bring Baez back because of the thumbs down thing. I don't think you don't bring Baez back because of the fact that he was struggling before that. I think, he was a good player when he was with he was a good player before, and he's an even better player with the Mets if they've actually figured something out and solved his swinging outside the strike zone. If he's going to walk at the rate he's walking now, that's great. If he isn't, that's great too. I think he was already sort of a good player. I think it's really hard to prognosticate what the Mets are going to do when you don't know who the front office is. You don't even know what the CBA situation is going to be. You don't sort of know.
Just for the record, Andy basically refuses to answer these questions because he's like, I don't know who the Mets are.
Right. Exactly.
It's for I just want to make you feel better because you have your baseball knowledge being similar to Andy's, where you want to give an informed answer because you're a reporter, but you don't even know who the Mets are because maybe the president of baseball ops that they hire thinks that his 10 walks in September in a couple of weeks were not an indicator of the hitter he'll be, and paying $150 million for an OPS or lower than 800 is silly. I don't know, but
we don't know. I mean, we're going to do the front office is a through line. We talked about the front office instability. The front office is doing stuff during the year too. They don't just make off-season moves. So I don't even know whether the Mets credit his plate discipline to something they've done or to a total fluke. Is that something? Did they fix him, or is he just having a great couple of weeks there? Did they fix something that we can't see? Or it's tough to predict in that way, and it's also tough to predict the way. I mean, we've heard Steve Cohen talk or tweet about spending money and the CBT is nothing to him or whatever, that at least if he's going to go over, he's going to go over it with gusto. But we have Robinson Cano coming back, which is some amount of millions of dollars. And I don't know if we're operating from a place of okay, well then you got to play him if you're paying him, or are we willing to cut him if he doesn't look good in spring training, or, where it's sort of, there's a lot of variables that are payroll level variables that are tough to predict. I think baseball wise, the Mets this is actually the hardest part about fixing the Mets going forward, is that I think that they put a lot of good players on the field. And it is really hard to think like, are they just going to run back the same team that
I'm so glad you made that point.
Below 500? And you're like, well, I don't know where are you trying to upgrade? Like they have great players on the field. They're just not playing well.
I'm so glad you made that point, because I think the bias conversation again is like, yeah, I mean, maybe they resign him, but I don't know if that means they'll be good again. I don't even know if that excites the Mets fan base, because, and I was talking to you about this right before we started the podcast, but I had a long Mets conversation with a diehard fan over the weekend. And he was saying, well, I think you bring Dom back because he might have a big bounce back year. I think the same about McNeil, and I love Pete Alonso. I think he's a good power hitter. And look, I'd love to bring Conforto back if they can sign him, because I feel like he's a solid player. And, we got DeGrom and suddenly you realize you just want the exact same team.
Yes.
So
exactly. I think that's right. I think that's exactly.
And the bullpen's like, he was like, yeah, Trevor May. I like Castro. I think Diaz. And you realize, okay, then why weren't they good? Because I really don't know the answer to it. And I've been my job, I earn a living on analyzing this team and talking about it 5 or 6 times a week. And I still don't really understand how they've lost more games than they've won, considering the fact that I don't even know what change I would make at every single position. How is that possible?
Yeah, I think, right. That's sort of what I was saying about Baez and what do you attribute these walks to, which is like, who, from the fan perspective or even a reporter perspective who's not inside the front office, I don't know which of these guys do you feel the most confident are going to have bounce back years? And that's got to be based on some internal understanding of their ceiling and what went wrong. I mean, it's sort of funny to think that the only analysis that makes the most sense in some ways is like, what do you do with Marcus Stroman, who I think was sort of pitching at his best and he's going to be a free agent. And it's like, all right, do you want to pay for that again next year? That I know how to analyze. It's just sort of like, yep, you need a pitcher. How much money does he want? Maybe you bring him back. Like, he doesn't have a qualifying offer, so he's going to hit the free agent market. But it's like everyone else, you need some level of internal analysis to be able to understand. I mean, we're talking mostly about position players, but then you get into the pitching. Like, I don't know what they think is going to happen with Syndergaard. Are you offering Syndergaard a qualifying offer? Well, I hope that the Mets trust their doctors, and I don't know.
He's not allowed to throw sliders or curveballs, and you're supposed to be able to make a decision on whether he's worth a qualifying offer or bigger contract than that. I don't know. So yeah, you're right. I don't know if the Mets front office wants to consider hiring me, but here's the analysis that I do. Jeff McNeil and Dom Smith were bad this year. They'll probably be good next year. That's the best that I can offer in terms of analysis. And again, if you'd like to hire me, you're more than welcome. And thanks to the Mets front office for listening to the Shea Anything podcast. Last thing before we go, Hannah, and this is going to end it on a hilarious note. Are we even going to have a season next year? What is your early read on what this looks like? And I know that's kind of an impossible question to answer, but I'm assuming you've spoken to more people than I have, certainly.
So I think there hasn't been a strike in a long time. Well, there won't be a strike. Sorry, there'll be a lockout. I think we'll get a lockout. So December 1st comes. I don't think we'll have a deal by December 1st, which has been the current CBA collective bargaining agreement expires. It's December 1st. What we saw the past 2 years, we haven't had a labor negotiation in a while. And we haven't had a labor negotiation with exactly these people because the union changed out their lead negotiator since the last CBA was negotiated. But we have the past 2 years of trying to play in a pandemic to look at, and that does not inspire a lot of confidence that they can get anything done without a really hard deadline staring them in the face. So I think the December 1st deadline, I think about it that way. That's sort of, what are the deadlines that are going to pressure these people to sit down and hammer something out? Because what we saw from the past 2 years is that given an open-ended situation, they are very unlikely to come to terms that they can both agree to. So I think the December 1st, the CBA expires, that deadline, not hard enough. So I think that'll come and go without a new agreement in place. That could lead to a lockout from the owners where they lock out the players, and then we won't get any offseason moves for however long that lockout lasts, which just backdate that information to all of our conversations about what the Mets are going to do, everything could be put on ice to come December. And so I think we'll get a lockout then. Again, all of this is very difficult to predict. The tricky thing becomes as we approach February spring training and then opening day. I actually feel like we will play 162 games because I think both sides at this point have so much money. I mean, the last time they missed games, people were just making less money. It was a less lucrative industry. I think that they are not so willing to miss regular season games as people think when they look at the sort of tenor of labor. However, I think spring training is a very tricky buffer beforehand, which is sort of, you got to give them enough time to ramp up, but is that a hard enough deadline to force them to come to an agreement? Or are they going to let spring training or the scheduled spring training start without a deadline and then try to figure out, all right, how soon do we got to get something done to get on the field whenever opening day is supposed to be?
Good. So we have that to look forward to. So you're saying that basically you think fundamentally once the regular season arrives that both sides, owners, players care more about regular season baseball being played than any of the issues that they will have been and will be negotiated?
Well, I think the players are more willing to strike than they have been for a long time. So I think the players, so much of labor negotiations, speaking broadly, comes down to the willingness of the labor to tolerate a work stoppage. And I think the past 5 years, and this is why people feel that the labor situation has deteriorated. I think in some ways that the sense that people have that the labor situation has deteriorated is a direct result of the fact that the labor side, the players, the union, has been preparing themselves for the potential of a work stoppage, because being prepared for that potential is the greatest strength that the players and the union side has. And so I think they are better prepared than they've ever been. Not ever been. Marvin Miller was a hero, but better prepared than they've been in the recent past to tolerate a work stoppage. So we might get one. However, I think my just straightforward prediction is we are setting up for a very messy stretch between December 1st and opening day, in which it mimics sort of what we've seen the past 2 years, the pandemic seasons, of trying to figure out when do we got to get a deal in place to get the season underway.
All right. Well, that's fascinating and a good kind of primer for what we have to not look forward to, but really to dread, because I don't know what we're going to talk about every day with that. As somebody who hosts a baseball talk show, no matter whether games are being played or not, we're going to be doing like, what's the better fall pant choice, khakis or corduroys, as our B block in November? I mean,
It's corduroys.
I just really don't. I mean, I just want it to be clean. And then I remember what it was like during COVID, the whole like, tell us when and where. Oh gosh, I try to block those things out, but thank you for illuminating some of that. And thank you for joining us, Hannah. This has been really fun and fun in some ways and kind of depressing in others, but really either way, I learned a lot in the last 30 to 40 minutes. So thank you. And by the way, if you're listening and you want to know more about Hannah's work, you can follow her on Twitter at
Hannah R. Kaiser, Keyser. Yeah,
and you can check out her work on Yahoo, and she appears on Baseball Night New York on SNY as well. Hannah, thank you.
This was great. Thanks for having me.
A reminder to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. We appreciate it. Give us a rate and review as well. And another reminder that Shea Anything podcast is brought to you by Verizon. 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. We will be back with you later this week with the one and only Keith Hernandez. We hope to have you back then. Thanks for listening.